Chapter 1, February 18th, 1945. The engine exploded at 800 meters. Lieutenant Erwin Ziller felt it before he heard it, a violent shudder that rippled through the airframe, followed by the sickening silence of turbine failure. Below him, the frozen fields of Oranienburg stretched white and endless. The Ho 229 V2, the world's first jet-powered flying wing, began to yaw left, hard. Ziller had 45 minutes of fuel remaining and one working engine. The aircraft had no tail, no vertical stabilizer, nothing to counteract the asymmetric thrust now pulling the wing into a spin. He pushed the control column forward. The nose dropped. He pulled back. The bat-shaped silhouette climbed briefly, stalled, dropped again. 3 times he dove, trying desperately to restart the dead Junkers. UMO 004B engine, screaming silence on his left side. Black smoke poured from the engine cowling. The fumes flooded the cockpit, acrid chemical choking. Ziller's vision began to tunnel. His hands moved slower on the controls. The ejection seat beneath him was primitive, untested, and at this altitude probably useless anyway. He made 4 complete circles at 20 degrees. Of bank, trying to line up with the runway, trying to breathe through the smoke, trying to stay conscious long enough to... The Ho 229 V2 impacted the frozen earth just beyond the airfield boundary at 2:47 p.m. Ziller died 2 hours later without regaining consciousness. The aircraft that Hermann Göring had called the future of the Luftwaffe lay scattered across 100 meters of snow-covered German soil, its revolutionary design reduced to charred plywood and twisted steel. But the dream didn't die with Erwin Ziller. Because 75 kilometers away in a heavily guarded workshop at Friedrichroda, another Ho 229 was taking shape. And this one carried a secret that would remain hidden for 38 years. Chapter 2, The Brothers. Reimar and Walter Horten were not supposed to build the future. They were supposed to fly gliders. That's what young Germans did in the 1930s when the Treaty of Versailles had stripped their country of military aviation. The government funded glider clubs as a loophole. Sailplanes weren't warplanes, so the victors of World War I looked the other way, while an entire generation of German youth learned to fly. But the Horten brothers weren't interested in conventional gliders. In their parents' apartment in Bonn, surrounded by wood shavings and technical drawings, they sketched something radical aircraft, with no fuselage, no tail, just wing. Pure wing. The Horten HI took its first nervous hops in July 1933, tethered to a bungee cord at Bonn-Hangelaar Airfield. Walter, 20 years old, lay flat on his stomach in the tiny cockpit, staring through a clear panel at the ground 6 feet below. Over the next decade, they refined the design. The HIV glider demonstrated that flying wings weren't just viable, they were superior. Without the parasitic drag of a fuselage and empennage, their aircraft glided farther, flew smoother, turned tighter than anything else in German skies. Even Jack Northrop, the American aviation pioneer, working on his own flying wing designs across the Atlantic, took notice. By 1943, both brothers wore Luftwaffe uniforms. Walter had become a fighter ace, flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s, with Jagdgeschwader 26 during the Battle of Britain, serving as wingman to Adolf Galland himself. He'd seen the war from a cockpit at 400 kilometers per hour, watching British Spitfires swarm German bombers that were too slow to survive. Reimar, the quieter brother, the mathematician, had continued designing aircraft, while serving as a glider pilot instructor. Then Hermann Göring issued his challenge the 3 Kawun 1000 requirement. 1,000 kilograms of bombs, 1,000 kilometers of range, 1,000 kilometers per hour. It was impossible. Everyone knew it was impossible. Jet engines could provide the speed, but they consumed fuel at rates that made the range requirement laughable. No conventional airframe could meet all 3 parameters simultaneously. Unless you stopped thinking about conventional airframes. Chapter 3. The Charcoal. The workshop at Friedrich Roda smelled of wood glue and charcoal dust. Reimar Horten stood over the wing section of the Ho 229 V3, watching technicians apply the special adhesive mixture he'd developed. The plywood skin of the aircraft wasn't just structural, it was functional in ways that went far beyond aerodynamics. British chain-home radar operated at 20 to 30 megahertz, bouncing electromagnetic waves off aircraft at distances up to 120 miles. Metal reflected those waves perfectly, creating bright signatures on cathode ray tubes that gave RAF controllers precise information about incoming raids, but wood reflected far less electromagnetic energy, and charcoal carbon black mixed with sawdust and glue, sandwiched between thin sheets of plywood, absorbed those radar waves like a sponge absorbing water. The charcoal diffused the incoming radiation, transformed it to heat, scattered it in random directions. The steel tubular framework of the center section would be shielded behind this electromagnetic barrier. The jet engines mounted inside the wing would disappear from radar screens. The entire aircraft would shrink its radar cross-section to a fraction of what chain-home expected to see. Reimar had calculated the effect against British early warning radar. The Ho 229 would be nearly invisible until it was already overhead. By the time RAF fighters scrambled, the flying wing would be gone, its incredible speed carrying it to safety before interception was possible. This wasn't just a bomber. This was a weapon that combined speed and stealth in ways the Allies couldn't counter. This was how Germany would turn the air war around. Chapter 4. December 1944. The Ho 229 V2's maiden flight lasted 17 minutes. Ziller had climbed to 3,000 meters over Oranienburg, testing the handling characteristics of the jet-powered wing. The 2 Junkers UMO-04B engines produced 980 pounds of thrust total, barely adequate, but the BMW 003 engines they'd designed for were still unavailable. The aircraft responded to control inputs smoothly, the elevons providing both pitch and roll authority. The split ailerons at the wingtips, acting as drag rudders, gave enough yaw control to keep the tailless wing stable. It was fast. Estimates put its top speed at 975 kilometers per hour, faster than any Allied fighter in service, faster than the Messerschmitt Me-262. In a mock dogfight conducted days later, the Ho 229 V2 had outmaneuvered the Me-262 despite having identical engines. The flying wing's lower weight and reduced drag made it simply superior. Göring was ecstatic. He ordered 40 production aircraft before the V2 had completed its 3rd test flight. The designation changed from HYX to Ho 229, and Gothaer Wagenfabrik began retooling for mass production. The Luftwaffe's planners were already discussing deployment 2 30mm Mk108 cannons in the wing roots for the fighter variant bomb racks for the strike variant. Some engineers proposed a 2-seat night fighter version with radar. The future seemed to arrive 17 minutes at a time. But the engines were temperamental. The early Jumo 004 turbojets were notorious for turbine blade failures, compressor stalls, combustion instabilities. They needed constant maintenance and had operational lifespans measured in tens of hours, not hundreds. On February 2, 1945, Ziller completed another successful test flight, though he damaged the undercarriage by deploying the brake parachute too early. On February 18th, he climbed back into the cockpit for the third time. 16 days later, he was dead, and the V-2 was scattered wreckage. Chapter 5. April 1945. General George S. Patton's 8th Corps rolled into Friedrich-Roda on April 14, 1945. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was in his bunker. Germany was collapsing from both East and West Soviet and American forces, crushing what remained of the Wehrmacht. But American intelligence had lists, long lists of German technological projects that needed to be captured before the Soviets arrived. The Gothaer Wagenfabrik workshop contained 4 Shu 229 prototypes in various stages of completion. The V-3 was nearest to completion's center section, largely finished jet engines installed cockpit functional, though it lacked the outer wing panels. Those were found 75 miles away, carefully stored and protected. The Americans understood immediately what they'd captured. Flying wing design was still experimental. Northrop had built the XB-35 flying wing bomber in the United States, but it hadn't entered production. Jet propulsion was bleeding-edge technology that only Germany and Britain had operationalized. A jet-powered flying wing represented the convergence of two revolutionary technologies. And there was something else, something about the construction that seemed odd. The plywood skin was darker than expected. The adhesive between the layers had an unusual texture, a grittiness that didn't match standard wood glue. Chemical analysis would have to wait. The priority was getting the V-3 out of Germany before Soviet forces arrived. The center section was crated carefully and shipped to Cherbourg, then across the Atlantic to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. The British examined it briefly at RAF. Farnborough considered installing British jet engines for testing, but the mountings were incompatible. By 1952, the Ho 229 V-3 had made its way to the Smithsonian's collection, where it sat in storage for the next 60 years, slowly deteriorating, its secrets waiting. Chapter 6. 1983. Reimar Horten was 70 years old when he revealed the truth. He'd spent the post-war decades in Argentina, continuing his flying wing experiments on a ranch in Villa General Belgrano. He'd designed supersonic deltas, cargo planes, experimental gliders. But Germany's defeat had robbed him of the opportunity to prove what the Ho 229 could have accomplished. In 1983, news broke about American stealth technology. The United States was developing aircraft that could evade radar detection using special materials and carefully shaped surfaces. The specific techniques were classified, but the concept was public coating aircraft with radar-absorbing materials could make them nearly invisible to enemy sensors. That year, Reimar co-authored a book titled Nerflugel, Only the Wing. In it, he explained what he'd done in 1944. He'd mixed charcoal and sawdust into the wood glue used to bond the plywood skin of the Ho 229. The charcoal absorbed electromagnetic waves, shielding the aircraft from British chain home radar. He'd planned this for the production model from the beginning. The V-3 prototype had received experimental applications of the mixture. The charcoal should diffuse radar beams and make the aircraft invisible on radar. He wrote, "Under this shield, then also the tubular steel airframe, and the engines would be invisible to radar." The revelation electrified the aviation community. Nazi Germany had experimented with stealth technology in 1944, 39 years before the F-117 Nighthawk, 44 years before the B-2 Spirit. The Ho 229 wasn't just a flying wing, it was history's first stealth aircraft. Chapter 7, 2008. The Northrop Grumman team arrived at the Smithsonian's Garber Restoration Facility in Maryland with portable radar equipment and sophisticated scanning instruments. They'd partnered with the National Geographic Channel to investigate Reimar Horten's stealth claims. Northrop Grumman built the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. If anyone could evaluate the Ho 229's radar-absorbing properties, it was them. The V-3 sat in the restoration bay. Its center section exposed its wooden skin, cracked and aged, but largely intact. The team used Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy to analyze samples of the plywood adhesive. They were looking for charcoal carbon black anything that would confirm Reimar's claims. The initial visual inspection was promising. The adhesive appeared darker than normal wood glue, with visible particles suspended in the matrix. Under microscopy, those particles showed properties consistent with carbon compounds. But detailed chemical analysis told a different story. The particles weren't charcoal. They were oxidized wood fragments, exactly what you'd expect from 70-year-old plywood. Cross-sections of the skin showed no cohesive layer of radar-absorbing material between the wood sheets, just standard urea formaldehyde, adhesive with naturally occurring inclusions. The radar testing produced mixed results. The Ho 229's shape did reduce its radar cross-section compared to conventional aircraft. The smooth blending of wings into fuselage, the absence of vertical stabilizers, the lack of propeller discs, all of this reduced radar reflection. Against British chain home radar, the Ho 229 would have been detected at approximately 80% of the range of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. But that reduction came from the shape, not the materials. The plywood skin offered no special radar-absorbing properties beyond what any sheet of plywood would provide. The charcoal, if it had ever been intended for the design, hadn't made it into the V-3 prototype. Russell Lee, the Smithsonian curator who'd spent years studying the aircraft, was direct in his assessment. The bottom line is that they couldn't say the aircraft was any stealthier than a regular sheet of plywood. Chapter 8. The Truth in the Wood. The Ho 229 V-3 sits today in the Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia. Visitors stare at its bat-wing silhouette, its sleek lines, its futuristic profile that looks like it belongs in a science fiction film rather than a museum of historical aircraft. The center section displays its tubular steel framework, the jet engine intakes rusted, but still suggesting the power they once housed. The wooden skin, carefully preserved, shows the grain of the plywood, the joints where sections were bonded together, the evidence of hasty wartime construction. There is no charcoal. Chemical analysis confirmed it. The stealth properties Reimar Horten claimed for his design existed only in shape, not in materials. Whether he genuinely intended to add radar-absorbing compounds to production aircraft, but never implemented it in the V-3, or whether the idea came to him decades later after learning about American stealth technology, will never be conclusively proven. What remains is the aircraft itself, an extraordinary achievement of engineering under impossible conditions. The Horten brothers designed a jet-powered flying wing in 1943 that flew in 1944, one of the first such aircraft in history. They solved control problems that had plagued tailless designs for decades. They created an airframe efficient enough to nearly meet Göring's impossible 3,000-1,000 requirement using fuel-hungry early turbojets. The Ho 229 represented genuine innovation. Its flying wing configuration reduced drag to levels conventional aircraft couldn't match. Its use of wood construction born from material shortages inadvertently reduced radar reflection compared to all metal designs. Its speed and maneuverability exceeded contemporary fighters despite being designed primarily as a bomber. But it was also doomed. By February 1945, Germany had months left. There was no time to solve the control problems that killed Erwin Ziller, no time to debug the temperamental Jumo 004 engines, no time to establish production lines or train pilots, or develop tactics for an aircraft unlike anything that had flown before. The charcoal story, whether intentional deception or honest misremembering, obscured the real achievement. The Ho 229 didn't need to be a stealth aircraft to be revolutionary. It was revolutionary simply by existing, by proving that flying wings could be fast maneuverable and practical. That legacy influenced every flying wing design that came after, from Northrop's YB-49 to the B-2 Spirit to modern unmanned combat air vehicles. When the B-2 made its public debut on November 22, 1988, the comparisons to the Ho 229 were immediate and obvious. Both were flying wings. Both used their shape to reduce drag and radar cross-section. But the B-2 incorporated genuine stealth technology, radar-absorbing materials, carefully controlled surface treatments, computer-designed shaping that scattered electromagnetic energy in specific directions. It was what the Ho 229 might have become if Germany had won the war, if development had continued for another 40 years, if the charcoal dust in the glue had actually been there. Chapter 9. What Remains? The question haunts the aircraft's history. What if? What if the V-2 hadn't crashed? What if Ziller had survived and testing had continued? What if Germany had held out another year, giving engineers time to refine the design, solve the stability problems, increase production? The answer is probably nothing. By April 1945, Germany was being destroyed from both east and west. Allied strategic bombing had crippled industrial capacity. Fuel supplies had collapsed. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Even if the Ho 229 had entered production, even if it had achieved its design specifications, it would have been too few, too late, operated by an air force that had already lost. But the what-ifs miss the point. The Ho 229's significance isn't what it accomplished. It never fired a shot in anger, never bombed a target, never fought a battle. Its significance is what it demonstrated, that radical approaches to aircraft design could work, that the flying wing configuration had genuine advantages, that jet propulsion would revolutionize warfare. Reimar Horten spent his final years in Germany, having returned from Argentina in 1983. He died in 1994 at age 79, never having flown a production Ho 229, never having seen his design fulfill its promise. Walter lived until 1998, dying at 85 in Baden-Baden. Both brothers carried the knowledge that they'd glimpsed the future of aviation, but had been born in the wrong country at the wrong time. The charcoal myth persists despite the evidence. In documentaries, in books, in internet forums, the Ho 229 is still called the first stealth fighter. The image is too compelling to die Nazi engineers working in secret to develop technology decades ahead of its time, mixing charcoal into glue to make aircraft invisible to radar, nearly achieving a breakthrough that would have changed the war. But the real story is more profound. The Ho 229 represents what human ingenuity can achieve, even in the darkest circumstances, and what it cannot achieve. Two brothers with slide rules and wood glue designed an aircraft that shouldn't have been possible with 1940s technology. They solved problems that professional aeronautical engineers said were unsolvable. They created something beautiful, efficient, and genuinely innovative. They just didn't make it invisible. The charcoal was never there, but the vision was real. And sometimes in the history of technology, the vision matters more than the truth. Because the Ho 229's true legacy isn't what it was, a partially completed prototype that never flew in combat. Its true legacy is what it inspired decades of flying wing development, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, the understanding that aircraft design could break free from conventional thinking. In the end, Reimar Horten achieved something more important than making one aircraft invisible to radar. He proved that the impossible was just improbable, and that sometimes with enough determination and enough genius, even the improbable becomes real. The Ho 229 V3 waits in its museum silent testimony to both what was achieved and what was claimed. Visitors photograph its angular beauty, its swept wings, its empty engine nacelles. They imagine it screaming through German skies at 1,000 kilometers per hour, invisible to British radar, a ghost made of wood and carbon. The aircraft doesn't correct them. It simply exists, a monument to innovation, to desperation, and to the stubborn human belief that we can make the impossible real if we're willing to mix charcoal into the glue and call it stealth.